Okay, so we're recording now. So good morning, everybody. My name's Rona Winnington. I'm one of the lecturers in adult nursing, and I teach mainly postgraduate and masters, and I also have a background as well as a nurse in sociology. So I come from a slightly different background than some of the others. So this morning, this session will probably be an hour and a half, maybe a little bit longer. Let's see how it goes. If you've got any questions throughout, just put your hand up and I will try and answer them. For those who are going to be listening this evening, any questions, either drop myself or Rachel an email. My email address is at on the last slide. So this morning, what we're going to look at is how to write a literature review. And for those who've done the previous narrative review, we are moving slightly differently this time into something a little more critical, but not always just about the methodologies. It's about the subject matter as well. So we're going to try and cover and get you to understand what a literature review is and its purpose in the context of doing research. Why do we bother doing one, really? To develop an awareness of differing types of literature review, there are two main types, and we'll go into them, but you will probably follow the traditional route. To understand how to undertake a literature review, so it's all about searching the literature, but there is so much out there, especially today when we have the access to the web and all the publications online and the libraries. We also have to learn when to stop and when to make that judgment call that actually we've got enough that frames our research. And we also need to know how to construct the review and also how to write it. Writing it is not just about being descriptive, and I've got a couple of charts and bits and pieces I think we should look at about how to be critical in our work. So it's not just about writing the description of we've read this and this is what it says. It's so what does that mean in the context of our literature? So first of all, we start off with what is a literature review? And this question, there's a couple of quotes here. Some of them are a little bit older, some of them a little bit newer. So an objective, thorough summary and critical analysis of the relevant available research and non-research literature on the topic being studied. And I think relevant is the key word in here. There is so much literature out there, you have to just narrow it down to be specific to your subject matter. And not all information for your literature review will come from published RCTs or things like that. Some of the grey literature can actually be quite supportive as well, particularly if it's around patient issues and experiences. So we need that sort of supportive evidence. And it's also to develop a strong knowledge base to carry out research and other scholarly, educational and clinical practice activities. And I think that's a really important sentence, that strong knowledge base, as being a foundation to your work. So it's your work, but you need to have a foundation of other people's work in order to support what is the gap in the literature or the research at the moment. And the last one is from a book around writing a literature review for health and social care. And the references are at the end of the PowerPoint. So reviewing the literature provides a complete picture, enabling information and research about health and social care to be viewed within a particular context. So this contextualizing of your research is really important. So if we're talking, my clinical background most recently is in community palliative care, although overseas. And so if I'm talking about end-of-life care, am I talking about in the UK? Am I talking about where I was in New Zealand? Am I talking about specific things in end-of-life for cancer patients or for those with maybe motor neurone disease or COPD? They're all slightly different. So we can talk about end-of-life, but everybody's end-of-life care is differing. So we need to have the right literature to support the framework that the research you're going to do. Any questions? Are you okay? I'm assuming that you are, Joe. So, the specifics of a literature review. This is where I talk about it frames and contextualizes your research question. So if you've got an idea around the research you want to do, you need to look at the literature that supports what you do, the work that's been done before, how that sits in relation to your question, and also identifying that gap. And there will always be a gap. There's so much research done, but there is always more to do. And so it's about the idea of the literature review is we start out with a big subject matter. So I talk about end-of-life care or palliative care. That's massive. And you talk on a global scale, it's enormous. So we narrow that down. So we go, palliative care is X, Y, and Z. But in the UK, we're doing this, and in my local area, we're doing this. And for this particular disease, this is what it is. So it's bringing, I hope that makes sense, in bringing it down, funneling it right down to be relevant to what you want to do. So with your substantive project, you're doing something very much practice related, and that's fine. So if you're looking at some audit, you look at the bigger picture on a global scale, and then bring it down to the UK, and then down to your area in the country, because all areas are different. We have different social stratifications, we have different healthcare problems, we have different ways of accessing it. So if you're in some of the affluent areas in London where people are very proactive, they'll do one thing. And if you're in some of the areas that are less affluent, then people maybe aren't able to achieve those outcomes. They can't afford to, or they don't have the knowledge base. So you bring it right down to you and your area and what you're doing. It is an objective, or as an objective piece of writing as you can do. It has to be critical, but it also no or few personal biases in there. And that can be quite hard when it's something that you are very passionate about, if you like, and keeping that bias out is difficult. I know there was a comment on my PhD where she said it's obviously a subject that's very close to my heart. Yes, it is. So I have to try really hard to not have that bias going. We talk about having to have a clear search and selection strategy, and we'll go into keywords and databases further on this morning. So you have to have a clear idea of what your research is in order to be able to develop those keywords, but we'll talk about that. Consistency and accurate use of terminology. This is one that is really important, so that your work has to be from the beginning of your introduction, right the way through to your conclusion. It has to be a cohesive and consistent piece of work. So if you use specific phrases or terms, so if I use palliative care, I don't go into end-of-life care and then flip between that and palliative care. I use the one phrase throughout. And so that means that you can, it can seem really boring, to be honest, and it can seem really repetitive, but that's actually what we're looking for in this case, because that gives us that idea that it is consistent and you know what you're talking about. And if you know what you're talking about, there's a better chance of the reader being able to do that. No jargon. No jargon, no colloquialisms, nothing like that. It has to be scholarly, professional writing. Referencing, we use the Plymouth Harvard version of referencing here. There is a link, I'm sure, on the reading list. And if not, if you go onto the library website, if you type in Cite It Right Plymouth, it will bring up the referencing. So it will tell you how to reference books, journal articles, conference papers, web links, and everything else that you're going to do. But don't use Google Scholar. It's not the best one. And we'll talk a little bit about criticality. So no, not so much description, but we are really looking for you to be critical of that evidence. I hope that's making sense. So if we're talking about critical, so a constructively critical account developing an argument designed to convince a particular audience about what the published literature indicates is and is not known, about one or more questions that the reviewer has framed. This book by Wallace and Ray is actually a really useful tool about critical thinking. Now I am just going to escape my PowerPoint for a moment and see if I can find this other one. I think it's in this one. Okay, so this, I can't open it up completely. Let me see. Oh, there we go. Oh, what's happened there? Oh, yes, there we go. So this is about critical thinking. And so instead of previous work and certainly undergraduate work, when you look at this diagram, we have description, which is less than a third of your work. So when you're writing the literature review, less than a third of the word count you've got allocated for it should be descriptive. So who, where, what, when, that's fine. So if you're talking about a piece of research that was done around your subject area, who conducted it? Was it an RCT? Was it a qualitative piece of work? Methodology, was it good? That's all great. But then we need to go into analysing it. And this is where we turn the undergraduate descriptive kind of thing into master's level scholarly writing. So you've got your how, where, when, what. That's great. But then you need to look at that again and say, okay, why is that, and how is that relevant to my research? Does it fit in with my research question, where I'm thinking this is going to go? Does it help me highlight the gap in the literature that my work will fill or attempt to fill? What if they did something differently? What if I did something differently? There's lots of ways of looking about it. So when you've asked yourself those questions, so when you've read a research paper and you've got your description, you've made some notes, and then you ask these 3 questions, you're analysing it. So, okay, how is this relevant to my work? And then you take it to the next step and evaluate it. So what? I read a lot of work where people will make fantastic statements, but they just make it in a single sentence. And you must always, if you make those statements, that's fine, but then take it to that next step. So what? What does this mean in relation to my work? What does this mean in relation to the bigger picture? And if you can look at your work throughout this research proposal and the next piece, the next project you're going to do, and answer that so what question every time, you're turning your work from description into a critical analysis. And this is where we're looking for those people. To get a master's degree, we need to be critical, and to get higher grades, we need to be really critical and think about that big picture, where it's sitting, what does this mean, why is this relevant, what can I do about it, can I do anything about it? We might not be able to. So I'm hoping that makes some sort of sense. This PowerPoint, this was what I used on Tuesday for the dissertation module, and it's available on the DLE for you to have a look through. So have a look through. There's a lot more on there about critical thinking, and I think that might be quite useful. So I'm just going to try and do that and go back to this one. Slideshow and current slide. There we go. Yes, I've got it done. So when we're thinking critically, those are the things we need to think about, and that if we build a literature review around that critical thinking and have some sort of flow to that critical thinking, it will lead you from that bigger picture that I talked about, that sort of global scale of the issue, right down to your piece of work. I'm hoping that makes sense. So why do we do it? Well, we do it so that it informs us of the research. It informs us of what's happened before. It informs us of what's missing. It also informs your reader, or those, if you publish or anything like that, what's happened before. So we all have our little niches of expertise, but we don't know everything. And so you have to look at writing your review in a way that it's for somebody who knows nothing about your subject. So you need to have that. That's why we go from global to UK to local and down. So we're setting a scene. We're setting a scene so that the non-informed reader can read it and understand why you're doing the piece of research you're doing. What is the point? Why is it important? Why is it of use to us? All of these kinds of things. So for real life projects, it sets the scene. You will always find it in most pieces of work. Academically, it also increases our knowledge and our understanding, and it also increases our ability to think critically. So it allows us to evaluate current practices. So by looking at that research and critically analysing it, we're saying, okay, so is this good practice? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, I don't know. But it allows us to think about it. What could we do better? It allows us to look at guidelines that we use. So we all have guidelines and policies and protocols at work. And some of them are good and some of them are evidence-based. I teach on evidence-informed decision-making as well. And it's amazing how many people will come through and say, actually, so many of the guidelines are out of date. So undertaking just a literature review, which would be more like a systematic review, which we'll talk about, provides the evidence for why we would need to change guidelines and policies, update them, go for the current research if that's what's showing to be the best. I'm just going to get myself a drink of water. So we have two types of review. Most of you will be following on this occasion for your substantive project a traditional or narrative literature review, which is what we will focus on mainly this morning. The other one is a systematic review of the literature, and this is where if you read a lot of journal articles that discuss things like randomized control trials and those kind of quasi-experimental research, this is where they come in. They go away and look at all the RCTs on a particular subject, so whether it's something to do with diabetes or COPD or whatever it might be, and look through them and evaluate what is the best evidence. And there is something called the Cochrane Library, and there's a link at the end of this PowerPoint to it. And it was set up many years ago as a resource for systematic reviews, and so it's the world's leading resource on it. So if you go on there, you will find a lot of literature where they do these systematic reviews to cover a specific area. It is quite medical as opposed to nursing and healthcare driven, and I think a lot of medical research is very much around trials and things like that, whereas I think a lot of nursing and healthcare research is moving away from that because we cannot quantify patient experience by numbers and number crunching. And so as Rachel and I were talking about yesterday about qualitative research and where it sits in the hierarchy, I don't pay much attention to that hierarchy because I think there's some very important work done on experiences that we really need to take note of. So we'll talk about a traditional narrative review. Sorry, I'm just having a drink. My voice is going already. So this is the kind of work that you're going to be looking at. And this is really important in setting the scene for your research. So for this piece of work, we are looking for a synthesized small literature review. When you come to do your project later in the year and early next year, you will be expanding it. So this is a foundation for your work for next year. So we've talked about the body of literature, and it summarises a body of literature relevant to your research project, and it critiques it. So we talked a little bit about that, and I think that's really important. So you want to contextualise your work. You want to set the scene. Setting the scene is a really good way of thinking about it for what's coming in the rest of your project or your research proposal. So identify what the problem is, talk about it in the bigger perspective, and then bring that down to your particular project in your particular area for your particular people. So that will be different for each and every one of you. So for this research proposal, we want you to synthesize this. And there is, like I said, there's so much literature out there. You have to have the confidence and the ability to say, that's enough for what I'm doing. As long as you can provide a rationale for why you stopped at a certain point, that's fine. And often this is usually done by timeframes. So most research, when you're doing a piece of particularly healthcare research, when we're looking at maybe other subjects, if we're looking historically, or my daughters do art history, so a lot of their stuff is much older, but for sort of healthcare scientific things, we really look at the last 5 years. Unless it's a seminal piece of work, and there are some out there, you really want literature from the last 5 years. And that's one way of narrowing down this huge body of literature that's out there. If, though, you find that there's insufficient in that 5 years, you can extend it to 7 or 10, but certainly don't go back beyond 10 years unless it's a seminal piece of work. You also need to make sure that it is absolutely relevant to your work. So you might read through an abstract and you think, yay, that's great, but you need to read the entire piece, because sometimes the abstracts can be a little bit misleading. So you need to think about that, and there is a lot of reading involved in this. So it's about providing that non-informed reader about why your subject is important, where it sits in practice, where it sits in the body of literature, where it sits in a national scale. Okay. You need to also tell us why this is important. Why are you doing it? Not just because I've got to do a project, or this is the easiest option, or whatever it may be. Why is this research important? Why is it important for you in the place you work? Is it important for patients? Is it important for patient safety? There might be a number of reasons. Is it important to improve practices? Like Rachel was talking about the one with the chest drains yesterday. Should we be routinely x-raying everybody? Should we be exposing them to that radiation unnecessarily? So it's about improving, and that's improving practice, and it's improving patient safety. So when you do the search for your literature, it also helps. So you'll have an idea of what you want to do, and you'll have an idea of a research question. Don't be afraid of that research question changing slightly as you'll go through your research and your literature search. That's quite a normal thing. And when you get to this level of study, we all start out with one idea, and we actually often end up with something completely different, and that's fine. So the example I would give is when I was doing my doctorate, I wanted to interview dying patients. I had this wonderful idea that I'd go and interview patients who are dying. I did work in community palliative care, and I would ask them about the choices they've made and if clinicians were really open to those choices. And then when I looked at the ethics, that was totally awful. So I did something completely different. So I looked at the same subject, but from a different perspective, using a different methodology and a different method of collection of the data. So don't be afraid that things might change slightly. So your research question or your focus may change depending on what the literature is saying. There may be so much work on what you want to do that you think, actually, I need to look at this slightly differently. And that's enough to fill a new gap, if you like. Okay, and we talk about conceptual and theoretical frameworks. I don't think for the project you're doing or for this particular proposal, we need to worry too much about that. I personally use theoretical frameworks where I look at a theory, say Michel Foucault, who's a French philosopher, sociologist, and I use his work on power and the medical gaze as a means of trying to understand how we work in healthcare and the power relationships that go on. But it's there to make you aware of it, but I wouldn't sort of pin too much on that at this point. Any questions at all? You okay, Joe? Okay. And so, quick thing on systematic reviews. So this is actually a research methodology method, if you like. It's very much a quantitative focused review, and I was talking about the Cochrane Library that there's a link to at the end. It's a useful resource, and I'd certainly encourage you to have a look at it. So it provides a complete list as possible of all the published and unpublished studies relating to a particular subject area. Excuse me, that's my phone. And it does give a good overview, very much of quantitative trial type research that's already been conducted, and it's always being updated, and it's a huge resource, absolutely. The other thing that's good about this is when people are doing these systematic reviews and they're going through all of the literature that's available, so it's a very time-consuming project. it's always worth looking at the reference list at the end. It's something called spidering, or certainly where I come from, it's called spidering. So you get a journal article that you think's really good, and then if you go to the reference list at the end and see what other articles or papers they've used in order to reference their work, it's a really good way of finding focused information. And I'll touch on it again later as well, and I think it's something worth looking at. If you just comb through that list at the end, you might just find the information you need. So we'll move back to the narrative review, because that was just touching base with the idea of the systematic reviews to make you aware of them. They're very much quantitative, but they are a good resource, and the Cochrane Library is very useful. So the narrative review, this is what you're going to be doing. And so this is an overview of the process. Don't underestimate how long this will take. Don't underestimate how long it will take to construct the idea of your research question, thinking about your keywords, thinking about where you're going to get your literature from. Then you need to read your literature, you make notes on your literature, and then you need to actually put it in some sort of order. We'll talk about constructing the review and writing it shortly, but don't go for that list format. At this stage in your masters, we're looking for that integration of the work. We're looking for you to be able to analyse one text against another, and not just paper 1 did this and paper 2 did that and paper 3. There's no analysis and critique in that, and it makes very dull reading as well. And then we're thinking, well, do you understand? We need that integration of thought. So you select your subject matter. I'm sure most of you have got some ideas. I would say the research proposal you're going to write for us for next month is an exercise. It is an exercise in writing a research proposal. However, do try and make it purposeful in that it will lead straight into your next module, which does start, I believe, in November. So we talked about being doable yesterday, make it doable. You won't have time to go through things like IRAS ethics, and also you shouldn't need to, because it's a professional project as opposed to maybe some qualitative research. So think about your subject matter and think about how you're going to collect that data. So how you're going to collect that data will still inform the subject matter for your literature review. You also need to think about something that's doable in the time frame that you're not going to need ethics for. You will not have time for ethics approval. Ethics can take months. Those on the current dissertation module started their ethics planning probably June, July this year for submission this month, and we won't get those back until October, November. So that's almost most of your module gone, just waiting for ethics. And then you're going to do a systematic search of the literature relevant to your subject. You're going to collate, read, analyse, critique the literature. As I talked about critiquing before, that's sort of how, why, so what next. You need to do that for each individual one. Then you're going to write it. So you've done all of this work, and then you're going to write it and your references. I don't know if any of you use EndNote. I think we had that discussion a little bit earlier with Joe. Use it. If it works for you, use it. It's a good way of doing it. Joe and Rachel know that I don't use it, but that's my personal preference. But if you don't use it, make sure your referencing is accurate. Come on. There we go. So selecting your subject. We're going to go through each of those points now. Selecting your subject, something of interest to you and your workplace. So we had this conversation yesterday about your workplace may want you to do X, Y, and Z, and that's not quite what you want to do. That might be a point of negotiation for you. Maybe you need to speak to them and say, well, you might not have time to do what they want, to be honest. Maybe what they want is a bit of number crunching, and that's not what you want. You're very much an interpretive researcher as opposed to being a positivist. It has to hold your interest. That's something I can't overemphasize enough. It has to be something that's of interest to you, that you want to find out, that you have some sort of passion about. Because if you don't, when the going gets tough, particularly in your next module, and it always does at some point when we're doing this kind of research, it has to be enough to get you through it. And that's something, so your manager might want you to look at the numbers of people who, I don't know, what can I think of? Something to do with cannulation or wound irrigation or whatever, and your subject, your interest is totally away from that. Negotiate. If they're funding it, you may really have to negotiate. If they're not funding it, then it is your piece of work. This is the other thing. People always have fabulous ideas. We've all done it. Don't ever think you're alone in it. We have these fantastic ideas that we think, this sounds fantastic. This is great. And then you come along to Rachel or I and we go, it's a bit big. It's a bit big for a PhD, that one, let alone for something that you've only got a few months to do. So don't worry about that at this point. For those who are coming along on Monday, it's something we will talk through with you and help you narrow it down to something that's doable. And then that also then reduces the amount of literature that you will need to read through when you're doing a literature review. So there is a purpose, but it has to be doable. It has to be doable in your time frame. And that will, like I say, narrow down that literature, so that reduces your reading, particularly if you get your keywords and databases spot on. You'll do really well with it. And this is another interesting point. Ensure there's sufficient literature available. This is at this level, when you've got a project that you haven't got a lot of time for, yes, I think it's important. I think if you were to do something in the workplace or for higher academic study, I wouldn't worry so much about that, because that actually means there's a huge gap. But when you're needing something to support what you're doing, just make sure, because I know on my last evidence-informed decision-making module, they had some great ideas, but there was minimal literature, so they struggled, and they only needed 5 pieces of research for their assignment. So think clearly. Any questions? We all good? Okay. So this is searching the literature. This is taken from the Masters module the other day as well. This is before you start. This is before you actually start putting keywords in or anything else, but you've got an idea about what you want to do. You need to think about what constitutes a strong knowledge base. So here we're talking about the difference between peer-reviewed journals, the things like the Cochrane Library, where there's some good evidence, any of the peer-reviewed ones, some of the books, and the difference between that and grey literature. Now, grey literature is non-research literature, so a lot of your media presentations, the journalistic articles as opposed to journal articles, Facebook, Twitter, all of those things, that's not going to be good enough for this. You can use some of that literature if you're doing some research, particularly around web content and narrative analyses of web content and things like that. But for this piece, we're really looking for you to look at peer-reviewed journal articles. Books are useful in understanding particularly like how to do a literature review, how to write a literature review, how to critique work. But as far as research goes for healthcare, it's journals. And anything, it doesn't matter as long as it's a good quality journal. So maybe not the Nursing Times so much, but some of the better ones. And we need to look at the known from the unknown. And this is what we were talking about yesterday with one of my colleagues who said that we know everything there is to know. Well, we don't. And it's by identifying gaps in literature and also in considering our practice in our professional way, in our professional roles. That's how we identify what's unknown or what needs to be revisited. So Around new knowledge and inconsistent knowledge, new knowledge is always interesting because yes, it's new, but we don't know whether it's right or not at this point. So new knowledge is a foundation for the next step, and that will always be happening. So it's what we know at the moment, but in 5 years' time, that new knowledge might be outdated or actually proven to be, as often happens, not much use to us. So before you start, you need to think, we've talked about synthesis, analysis, and critique and relevant approaches. And you need to outline and think in your head about the potential impacts on practice, particularly for your substantive project, because it's all practice related as opposed to theory related. So you need to think about why are you doing this? Is it worthwhile? Is it relevant? Is it of use? Okay. So some of these things are more related to the dissertation, where they're doing an ethics-based piece of work, if you like, but I wouldn't worry too much at this point. So searching the literature. This can be really daunting, and you can feel very much overwhelmed by it. And I think that's normal, and I wouldn't worry too much about it. Once you get started and you need to have a very structured approach. You need to be thinking about what it is you want to know, and you need to be really quite ruthless in accepting or rejecting work. Have confidence. Because when you submit this to us for marking and when you take this forward, Rachel and I are not experts on all the areas. We're more experts on how to construct a research project, our knowledge base is around methodology and methods, how to critique and analyse, so not your subject matter. You will be the expert on your specific subject. So we don't know what you have and haven't included, but we will know if there is a lack of consistency in what you're writing. We will see that there's a gap somewhere in the literature that you've omitted if it doesn't flow. So, but you need to have the confidence to be able to say yes or no to some of the papers you read. So if we look at ways of finding the literature, the standard approach, the inductive method of looking back through databases, journals, abstracts to form a list of potentially relevant material. This is the most likely way you will go forward. And I think it's a good way of doing the research for your work for this module and next. And this is where I talk about going back through databases with the time frame, and time frame is really important, and using respected journals. So you can use anything like even the BMJ. They've got actually some really good open access stuff at the moment, and not everything is around RCTs and experimental data. There's a lot more qualitative information coming through the BMJ at the moment. The network approach, where there's a recent paper that's been published in one or more relevant journals. Now, this is on here. That doesn't actually happen in practice, because if a paper is published in one journal, another journal will not publish the same paper. They might publish a similar one by the same authors, but it won't be identical. But if it's in one or more, or there's something similar by the same authors, then that's worth looking at. We talked about spidering, so the use of the reference list from the same journal or journal article to trace further references. So if you've got something that's from 2017, and there will be information out there from 16, 17, there's a wealth of it. I get through to my inbox every day a heap of new papers. What was I going to say? Yes, look at the reference list. Look at the reference list at the back of each of those really good papers and see what there is. And you might come across some of the seminal works in there as well, especially if you read 2 or 3 and it's repeating the same people, then you know that that's actually something that you need to include. If you sign up, to Sage Publications, it doesn't cost anything. So that's SAGE Publications. You can go on there, sign up, and they will deliver to your inbox twice daily sometimes the latest publications in the field of interest you have. And I certainly find it's a really useful way of keeping up to date. So they do publications on methods, methodologies, qualitative, quantitative research. They also do it by subject. So I've got palliative care, I've got sociology, I've got gender studies, masculinities, all of those things that are of interest to me, and they come through every day. So I've got the latest published research without having to go to the databases. So it's worth thinking about. And then you've got the manual searching of journals. I don't think any of us do that these days. I know I had to, going back to the dark ages when I did my nurse training, and those little cards boxes you have in libraries. But with the internet, the only thing I would say at this stage is don't use Google Scholar. I know it's tempting, and I know it's quite easy, but Google Scholar picks up on your search history of your computer, and so it may not bring all of the information you need, and this is why you need to go through the databases, and we'll talk about those in a moment. Well, okay, any questions, Joe? Cool. Find my mouse. So you've got your research question, or what you think will be your research question, or your subject matter, and you've narrowed it down. So once you've narrowed it down, you need to then think about the keywords that you're going to use to search the databases. And some of those will be, you will already know what they are, because you'll know. Ooh. Okay, thanks, Joe. Keywords are important, and some of this will be informed by your knowledge and practice. So you need to think about reflexivity, and I think we touched on reflexivity yesterday, and it comes into particularly healthcare research. And if you acknowledge in your writing that some of the keywords came from your reflective practice, that's absolutely fine, and that's a good starting point. And I think one of the things I would say is acknowledging reflexive content and providing rationales for decisions is fine. So there's no right and wrong, providing you've provided us with a clear rationale for your decision making. So don't be afraid to make decisions, and don't be afraid that things might not be perfect and they might not be absolutely right. That's what happens in research. So don't worry about things like that. So keywords, the most common method of identifying literature, absolutely. So what you need to do is think clearly about the keywords that are used. Now, when I talk about keywords, when in the English language, we use certain phrases, and I've been working overseas for 10 years. And so some of the things, and I used it in my evidence-informed decision making, sometimes we are talking about the same thing, but we use different words. It's not a professional word I'm talking about here, but I'm thinking things like, if we talk about chips, as in fish and chips, we talk about chips. Where I was, chips are actually crisps. So if you're looking for the same thing and you're looking overseas, you'd have to call it hot chips. So hot chips are what we call chips, and what we call crisps are called chips, if you get my meaning. And in practice, things like paracetamol was called Panadol over there. So they referred to it by the brand name, and the same for sticky plasters. They were called Band-Aids. And cocodamol was referred to as Panadine. So if you're doing a search, you need to be mindful that you might not get all the literature unless you think about how these your subject matter is considered overseas, because some of the literature, you don't have to use just British literature. You can use American, Australian, New Zealand, and European. I probably wouldn't go any further than that. Canadian's fine, but there's some good research out there on a global perspective that can actually inform some of your work as well. And the reason I say that is, in palliative care, now that I've come back home, I'm quite shocked at that we're not doing things here that were commonplace overseas, both in Australia and New Zealand, that helped patients significantly. And so I'm now working with one of the hospices locally to try and get that out of hours crisis intervention modified so it's less stressful for patients and families. So going back to keywords are very important. You will need more than one, you will need several. Now, what I suggest you do, you have to include this in your write-up, and I'll talk about how to later, but keep a record. Keep a record of all the keywords you've used, and all the databases you've used them on. So we'll talk about databases next. So if you use 3 databases, you probably use more, but if you use 3, you need to use all those keywords on all 3 databases to give consistency. You may find that some of the papers you get are duplicated, and that's okay. Your keywords are working. It's bringing up the right literature. Sometimes, if you don't get that right, you will miss the literature. And this is where I'm saying we might not know the literature, but we'll be able to tell if something's missing. And that then affects the quality of your research, because if you've omitted something that's key, how can we know that it's your research is filling a gap that isn't already filling? I hope that makes sense. My voice is going. My family will be happy tonight. And so keep this record and use it in all of your databases. Once you've reached saturation point with that, you can then use relational words, things that might sit slightly outside your subject area. So if you're talking about palliative care for COPD, then you might want to go for palliative care for respiratory disorders, and then we just take it out a little bit just to make sure we're not missing anything. It is time consuming. Do not be surprised at how long this will take you, and the sooner you start, the better, really. And even if you haven't refined your question, you can still start looking. Then you need to think about truncation. So this is using words, part words and an asterisk. So if you're looking for information and it's not bringing it up, so if you want something to do with nursing or whatever it might be, so you put NURS and then asterisk, it will bring up all the titles that's got nurse, nursing, nursed. So it's all those endings. So if you put just nurse in, it'll miss nursing. Or if you put nursing in, it'll miss nurse and nursed. I hope that makes sense. So you can do that with any words. And that actually helps, but you just be careful in refining. Then you can use Boolean searches. So you can, if you go into the advanced literature search on Primo, you can put, I want this word and this word, or I want this word but not this word. So I want palliative care and COPD, or I want palliative care but not end-of-life care. And that way it's refining. We're taking it down. So we've started big, like we do in the whole literature review and writing, and then we're narrowing it down to what you want to find. And the final thing to use is parentheses. So if you've got, rather than a word, it's a phrase, and you want that exact phrase, it might be, like we go end-of-life care. If we've got end-of-life care, we want that in parentheses, and then it will look for that phrase. It won't look for end and in one place and of in another and life in another. It will look for that entire phrase, and that actually reduces the burden in your search as well. So I hope that makes sense. You've got this to refer back to, and do just send us emails. We're quite happy to answer them. So databases, there are hundreds of databases, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. These are some of the most popular for healthcare in the UK. So you've got the British Nursing Index, which is now ProQuest. All the links are on the last slide. You've got CINAHL, which is a nursing and allied health one, the Cochrane Library for your systematic reviews that we've talked about, maternity and infant care, PubMed. PubMed is one of the big ones. You've got PsycInfo, that's actually the American Psychological Association. Applied Social Sciences Index and Abstracts, ProQuest, the Internet, Google Scholar, and there's loads of others. So when you go onto Primo and library website, you'll be able to pick out which ones you want to use. Do not search them all. Look at the ones that are going to give you the most relevant data. So sometimes it will be PubMed and CINAHL. Sometimes you want to go a little bit further out that and look at maybe JSTOR if you're going a bit more sociological. You've got APA for psychological. Google Scholar I've included on there, but I wouldn't recommend it at this stage, but it is there. And then you've got the general internet, but you know, that's not really the way we're going at this level. So those are on here. The links are on the last slide. And like I say, when you go onto the library, there will be more. So categorizing your literature. So I talked before about peer reviewed and non-peer reviewed. So we're looking really for peer reviewed literature. That's the most important, the most reliable at this point. And then you've got non-peer reviewed, so you've got your newspapers and you've got your web pages and things like that. So I'm not really looking to see, what's it called, is it WebMD and things like that. That's not what we're looking for at the moment. We're looking for much more thorough, scientific, methodological approaches. Then you need to think, is the paper a review, a description, or is it research? Because some things that are published are not research, they are opinions. So people are asked to write reviews on things, they're asked to write an opinion piece, it might just be a description of what's happened. If it's a description, I really would avoid it. You're really looking for research at this point to support your piece of work and your research question. Okay. Consider the views expressed in the papers themselves. What are they trying to get over? Everybody, I don't care what anybody says, there's always a bias. There's always a bias in everything that's written. There has to be. But just have a think about what they're trying to get over, what their message is. Is it helpful to you? If it's not helpful to you, that doesn't mean you omit it. It just means that you critique it. So, and the example here is, so you've got 10 papers, 5 may express similar views on a subject matter, and the others may be differing. That's okay. That's actually okay, because if everyone's saying the same thing, it actually makes it less interesting. But if there's other people thinking differently about it, that's when you can really critique, you can really analyse and critique. So why? Why are they saying something different? Why does that matter? Why is that important to my research? So don't be afraid of that. Actually go with it and use it. I think it can be invaluable at times. So I'm hoping that's clear. So you're going to then analyse your literature. So what I suggest you do when you've done your search and you've got your papers, and you will have a lot to read, you can read the abstracts and the conclusions to see if it's of value, and that's a good way of, you can certainly bin some by doing this. But what you really need to do is read the entire paper, read it in its entirety without critiquing it. Read it so that you understand what it's saying, and then you'll know if it's relevant. Then you need to read it again to critique it and make some notes. So try, and I find it very hard, and I'm saying this as being best practice, but I find it very difficult to read without critiquing it in the first instance. But if you can, do so. You get an overview of what they're saying. You'll understand where they're coming from. You'll understand what the gaps in their research is. You know, it'll give you some ideas of the literature that's available. Critique, make notes. We all do this differently. Some people will make copious notes and will type them out. Some people will just put headings. If you're like me, I put about 3 words at the top of the page and go back to it when I'm ready. Probably not the best way, but we are all different, but it's whatever works for you. We're not going to assess that. We're not going to see that. So it's how it works for you is important. And we have to be realistic that there's a preferred way of doing it, and there's the reality that we're all working and we all have lives outside of our study. So whatever works is fine. But be critical. Okay, and be systematic. So we've got a PQRS acronym, which we'll go into in a second. So be systematic in your approach. Start with the first one. Maybe read 2 or 3 papers a day if you can get through that many. Some of the longer ones will take a bit longer. And have a deadline. Work to a deadline, because you have only got 4 or 5 weeks or something to have this piece of work in. So be really structured in your approach. So we're going to talk PQRS. So this is about preview all sources of information. So you don't just need, if you're looking at journal articles and we're looking at peer review, that's great. But if you're doing something that's related to practice, you may need to look at your policies and guidelines. You may need to look at those at a local level, and you may need to refer those back to national and international guidelines also. So I'm thinking NICE in particular here, and HEE and all of those kind of organisations. So don't be afraid to look at policies and guidelines and critique those also, and include them as they are, if they are relevant. So you need to question the source of the paper. So we've talked about quality of papers, primary, primary research, secondary research. So your primary research is where somebody goes out and conducts the research. So that might be interviews, it might be observation, field observation, clinical trial, any of those kinds of things. Secondary research is where it's a bit like the systematic reviews, to be honest, is where they look at the research that's been done and then have an opinion, form an opinion of that research. Both are okay. Both are absolutely fine. And then you've got your non-research or your grey literature, which is your media representations, web pages and things like that. Some are okay, but I would think for this piece of work that you're probably not going to use much of that. So then we're going to read through it, like I've said, and you can use, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the CASP tool, which is the critical analysis tool. There is a link at the end of this PowerPoint for that as well. And if you click on that page, it's really useful because it gives you a flowchart almost of how to critique each type of paper. So when you go onto the main page, there's a yellow box or 8 yellow boxes together, and it will say systematic reviews, quantitative, qualitative, I don't know, ethnography, phenomenology, whatever else it is, and it gives you a way of summarising the research that you've read to be able to critique it. So I would really encourage you to have a look at that for each of the papers, particularly if you're struggling to analyse and critique a paper. This might just be what helps you through that. Okay, and then this is write this short summary of your thoughts on paper, strengths, weaknesses, your understanding of the paper, where it sits in the context of your research. Okay, so it's all very well going strengths and weaknesses and understanding, but it's also understanding that in relation to what you're doing, and that's part of that contextualization as well. So it all sort of flows really when we get through it, but always relate it back. So when you're reading research, always relate it back to, so what does this mean in relation to my question, my research, my literature review, my methodology, my methods. Okay, and if you start thinking like that, you will get to a point where you read the papers and it becomes quite second nature to you. But I certainly would encourage you to look at the CASP tools. I think they're very useful for this kind of evaluation. Okay, I'm just going to have a quick drink because my voice is giving way. So, having sourced all your literature, and I say sourced all your literature, when you start writing, maybe not for this module, but for your next module, you may start writing and think, actually, I haven't got everything I need, and you'll go back, and that's okay. So don't ever be afraid that you have to stop. We don't know what you're doing, as long as you've got the full body of work when it comes to submitting it. So if you start writing, and then you think, actually, there's a bit missing, or this isn't quite flowing, go back to the databases, go and see what else there is, because you'll then identify another gap in your writing, and so it's okay to go and see if there's something that will help support what you're trying to say. Okay, so don't ever be afraid of that. It's not a one-off exercise, the literature review, but you need to start by having a substantial amount of work done, and then you can always dip back in and see what you need. So when you're writing it, we're writing it in 2 ways, and we're thinking in 2 ways. We're thinking for this module, and we're also trying to help you think ahead for your next module. So this one is going to be much shorter, but it will still comprise the same. So it's an introduction, a body of work, and a conclusion. In master's level work, it is encouraged that you use subheadings. Okay, so when you'll have an introduction to your overall research proposal, heading, literature review, heading, and within that it's okay to have introduction and then some subjects, and I'll talk about subjects in a little while, themes if you like, and then a conclusion, and then you'll go on to your methodology as your next section. So have headings. It makes it easier for you to write. So when you're looking at your literature, and I've got a little table we'll show you shortly, when you're writing your literature up and you're framing it, you can write it in themes and then it flows better as well. And this is where I'm talking about that sort of integrating the work rather than it being paper 1, paper 2, paper 3. But we'll touch on that shortly. So the introduction, the purpose of the review. So you need a brief overview of the problem, the issues to hand, the gap in the literature, the gap in the research, what it is that you're trying to do. Okay. And here you're going to summarise the literature sources and the key search terms used. So your keywords, your databases, your time frame for going back, so 5, 10 years. If you are going back more than 5 years, you need to provide a rationale why you've done that. That will usually be because it's insufficient literature in a 5-year time frame, but if it's 7 or 10 years, tell us why. Okay, and if, like I said before, if you give us a rationale for it that is a justifiable rationale, we're okay with that. It just means that we know that you're aware of why you've chosen that. So the keywords and databases need to be included here. There are a couple of ways of doing it, and it depends on how extensive your list of keywords are. Sometimes you can put it in a table format within the introduction, and that's okay. And the same for the databases. Or you can include it in the appendices. And sometimes the appendices are quite useful because you can, particularly if you've got extensive keywords and phrases, and you've used a number of databases, and you've done Boolean searches and all of those things, you can put it in there and it doesn't count your word count. So that's one way of doing it. Or you can put it in a table format, and you also need to have your inclusion and exclusion criteria. So you looked at palliative care but didn't look at end-of-life care. You looked at COPD but you didn't look at cancer, motor neurone disease, heart failure, whatever it might be. So, and why? Why have you included some and not included others? Okay, so that's that rationale, why have you done this? And this is where I say be confident in keeping some literature and not others. Okay, and you also need to make some comment in the introduction of the literature review about the breadth and depth of the literature sourced. And this is where again you say, I did this, but I didn't do this because. Okay, I hope that is clear. So it's giving us an idea of your thought processes behind what you've been doing. Okay. So the main body. I'm just going to escape from here because I want to talk about, if I can find it, this one, this matrix of coding. This is just a really simple diagram. Okay, I'm hoping you can see this. So I've taken an example of 5 papers, and I've just used methods and sampling and things along the top. So when you have got your research and you develop some themes, so when you're reading your research, you will think about what are they trying to say, what are the themes that are coming out of here. And one will be, the example I've got here is the method used, is it appropriate, the sample size, the type of analysis used, were the results sound or not, were the conclusions relevant. So in paper 1, the methods were appropriate and the conclusions were relevant. Paper 2, it was the sample size and the analysis and the conclusions, 3, and so on. So when you come to write up your literature review and the main body of it, what we're looking for is that you identify the themes. This is what I'm going to discuss. So you may find that you had 10 or 20 themes. You cannot discuss all of them in any depth in the piece of work you've got. You haven't got the word count to do it. So you can say, I identified 10 themes arising from the literature relevant to my research, but I'm actually going to discuss 3 or 5 of them in here, and these are the most appropriate. And then you go on to your first theme, and the first theme is going to be methods used were appropriate. And here, in this section, you are going to then talk about what you read in paper 1, paper 3, and paper 4. We're not bothered about 2 and 5 at the moment, just those 3. When you finish discussing this, critiquing, analysing, so what, you're going to then move on to sample size. So you'll signpost us onto the next section. Use a subheading. Absolutely fine. And in this section, you're actually only going to discuss paper 2 and 3 because this is relevant to your thing. You can comment why you're not discussing the others, but 2 and 3. And then again, your next section, you're going to discuss paper 2, 3 and 5. I'm hoping that makes some sense to you. So you don't need to discuss all aspects of every paper. You need to draw out the themes that you've discovered you think are relevant, and then discuss them in some sort of format like that. If you've got any questions on that, just drop me an email, because or I'll talk to you on Monday about it, because I think it's really important. So if we go back to our PowerPoint here, I'm getting good at this. Okay, so this is where you're going to discuss the findings of your literature search. So this isn't your research, this is just your literature search. So when you're starting to do this proposal, there are many sections, and when you come to do your research, this is what you're going to do again on a slightly bigger scale. So you're going to present the findings, you're going to contextualize those themes in relation to your particular project, in relation to your interest, in relation to your subject matter, in relation to where you work. Be critical. Go back to that diagram I showed you earlier, the first one with the so what in it. Be critical, not descriptive. Okay, you will have to set the scene a little bit. But so if we're talking about methodologies, you set the scene about methodologies, then you critique the papers that they're relevant to. So-and-so said this did that, but so what? What does this mean to me? What does this mean to my research? What does this mean for the future? What does this mean about the research that's been conducted in the past? All of those things. Okay, and using a thematic approach. Now, this is what I was talking about, this table I've just shown you. So you identify themes. Now, identifying themes, there's some interesting quotes on identifying themes, and they talk about themes emerging from the literature. And we're getting a little bit more philosophical here, but themes don't just emerge, they're informed by our prior knowledge and reflexive practice. Okay, so if you can acknowledge that in your writing, that's also helpful. So themes will come to the fore for you because of your experiences, your professional practice, your knowledge, and your reflexivity. Reflexivity in healthcare is very important. Make sure that these flow. So use headings, absolutely, but do that signposting. I don't know if you're all familiar with signposting when you're writing. So when you're getting towards the end of a section, or even a paragraph, you should always be signposting to the next paragraph what you're going to say next. And the same with this. So at the end of the methodology section, you say something about sampling, and then you move on to sampling. I'm only using these as simple examples. That's not what you're going to discuss, but that's what I'm trying to sort of get through. So signposting is really important. It gives that cohesion, that consistency in your writing, and it signposts the non-informed reader as to where they can expect to go next. Okay, so you're going to summarize the themes and how they interrelate. So that's that bit about introducing this section. This is what I've done. This is where it sits in the context of the world, the UK, my practice. And then you're going to say, these are the themes that you've identified. These are the ones you're going to talk about, okay, and then interrelate them. You can acknowledge if there's any consensus or difference in the themes. So it's really important about this. And like I said previously, differences are actually good. Differences make it easier for you to critique. Differences make it easier for you to write something that's interesting, original, and thought-provoking for change in practice. So don't be afraid of that at all. So you do have to, as well as, this is where literature reviews can be very complicated. So in this instance, you're going to critique the methodologies, the research design, the results, justify any inconsistencies, as well as discussing the subject matter. So it's not just the methodologies used, we want to know about the subject too. So you've got quite a lot to include, really, if you like. So you're going to critique the qualitative, quantitative methodologies. So this is back to our interpretive positive approach. Is this the most appropriate thing for the research that's been done? Okay. Is this answering their question? Is this going to answer their question? Does it answer their question? And then you're going to talk about the methods. So this is the research design, whether it's in ethnography, an autoethnography, narrative analysis, a web content analysis, quantitative longitudinal studies, etc., etc. There are so many out there. There are so many different ways of doing it. And like I said yesterday, but to keep it simple, there was an instance where somebody had heard something about feminist ethnography and they thought that was sounded really good. Don't do that. Don't do that. Choose something that works for you and your design. Okay. So you're going to talk about the results and the strengths and weaknesses in relation to your subject matter and your research. Okay, so it's not just the results. I'm looking for a bit more than that. I'm looking for you to be able to discuss the research design and the results in relation to the subject and your research. And then justify any inconsistencies and if they were acknowledged, discussed in the paper. So there's problems in the paper. And just because it's published doesn't mean to say that it's unproblematic. There may be problems in it, and it's actually really important to talk about those, because that again gives you that critique and any gaps in the studies. Okay, and there will be. Don't ever think anything's perfect, because that doesn't exist. So look for them. Okay, be confident to comment on it is what I would say. And so my final thoughts on this is just more about your writing style. Okay. This is about be objective and try and remove bias. And this is slightly contradictory when I'm saying be reflective. But I'm talking about being reflective on your knowledge base that informs your decision making around your research and around the literature you choose, the key words you choose. That's fine. That's not so much bias, that's reflexivity. But when you're arguing around the methodologies used in regard to the subject matter and your research question, this is where you have to remove that bias. You have to be objective. The more objective you are, the more structure and rigor your research will have. Okay. Be constructive. It's all very well to say a piece of research isn't very good. You might think it's rubbish. You might think it's absolute rubbish. But don't say it in those ways. Be constructive about it. You can comment that it maybe didn't meet criteria or it wasn't good enough, but do it in a constructive way. They could have done this better. This might have produced better results if. So we don't want sort of negativity. And that's not saying that things aren't right or things haven't been wrong. It just means do it in a professional way. Okay. Quotes. Don't use up your word count with quotes. You don't have enough words to use that. If you use a quote, it has to be a good one. Quotes are useful, particularly if you're doing qualitative interview type research and you're supporting your statements with evidence. That's fine, and we would expect to see them. But in the main body of a literature review, quotes should be absolute minimum. They can be wasted. If you do use a quote, and sometimes there are some really good ones out there. The one about themes emerging is one of my favourites, which I can get for you if anybody wants it. You then need to talk about the quote. So again, you critique it. So if you put in a quote and you're talking about themes emerging, and we have this quote about they don't emerge, it's a result of our reflective practices. But then you need to go on and discuss that quote. You need to critique it. So what? Why have you used it? Why have you put it in there? How is that relevant to your argument? Okay, so I don't want to see quotes just stuck in without any kind of critique. So you should always follow a quote. There should be a critique. Don't be descriptive. Just don't be descriptive. Go back to that chart I showed you earlier, and a little bit of description. Less than a third, probably 25% max, maybe 20% even, and then analyze and critique. That's where you'll be improving your thought processes, and that is also where you will get your marks. Okay, analytical, critical. When you're writing, pay attention to typographical errors. Have clarity of thought. consistent, cohesive. It has to be throughout the entire research proposal and your research that you're going to do later this year, next year. There has to be a cohesive element so if I look at the introduction, the literature review, your methodologies, your results, your discussion and your conclusion, they all link together, and you always link it back to your research question. Also, pay attention to typographical errors, spelling errors. No excuse for spelling errors these days when we have Word and the spell checker. Punctuation. Please read your work out loud, even if it's to yourself, because if you read it out loud, you know where you need to put your commas. Okay. Paragraphs, not too short, not too long. I had one recently that was 1.5 pages as a single paragraph, and then I had another one that every sentence they wrote was a new paragraph. A paragraph should relate to one subject matter, one topic you're discussing, move it on. If you need to discuss it over several paragraphs, that's fine. So you just frame it, signpost to the next one, and move on. Think about the flow. I'm very fortunate in that my daughter is also academically interested. And so when I do my work, even my 90,000 words for my PhD, we read it out loud over several nights. And by reading it out loud, we knew it was consistent. We had the right terminology throughout. We didn't use different words. My structure was right. It flowed. All of those things take that time. But if you haven't got someone that will read it with you, do it yourself. But read it out loud. Really important. I can't say highly enough how important that is. Okay. And you also need, so as you're getting through this literature review, we've started with that bigger picture scene setting, we've got the literature, we're funneling it right down to your research. This is where you articulate the gap in the literature, the gap in the research that you are going to do. Okay, this is really important in this section. This is the whole point of the literature review, is to say, this is what's been done, this is what I think of it, this is where my research is going to sit. Now, I hope that makes sense, but that's the point. So we start big, we funnel down and down to yours, and you then identify the gap, what it is you're looking at. Why are you looking at it? Okay, because this then leads on to the methodology, this section. So we need to end this section in knowing what we're going to look at. We don't need the aims, we don't need the objectives in this section, but we want to know what the gap in the literature is and how you're going to fill it. Okay. I'm just having a quick look at time. Oh, we're doing quite well, actually. So the conclusion. So you've got your introduction to your literature review. You've got the main body where we funnel right down to your research and your conclusion. So it's a bit of a repetition, and this is what happens when you're writing dissertations and theses, is that the introduction tells you what we're going to do, you do it, and then we conclude by saying what we've done. And this is exactly the same for this literature review. So you introduce it, this is what I'm going to look at, this is how I've obtained my literature, you discuss your literature, you discuss your gap of where your research sits, and then you're going to tell us what you've just done. Okay, so it's a summary of your findings, a summary of the findings from the literature that contextualizes your research within that body of current knowledge. Okay, yeah, my recording's gone. Can you still hear me, Joe? You back online? It's a little bit intermittent. Okay, good. Let me go back, because we're almost finished, so we should be okay. Let me go back. I'm hoping you haven't missed too much of it. But we can always talk again on Monday as well, so don't worry. So your conclusion is this idea of you're going to tell us what you've done in a more succinct manner, and you're going to contextualize all of that literature and your research in relation to that current knowledge base. Okay. You're going to identify and offer a rationale for future research. Okay. I wouldn't worry too much about that at this point, but you can make some recommendations. And recommendations or implications for practice, okay, based on what you've read and what you need to do for your research. This is where you're thinking about moving forward. So with regards to practice, education, patient experience, whatever it might be, this is where you're starting to think a little bit further ahead. But I think my main concerns in this would be that you are identifying or contextualizing your work in relation to the body of knowledge that exists. Okay, you know where it sits. And then from here, both in the research proposal you're going to do this time and the one you're going to do next year, this section then leads into your methodology. So having reviewed all the methodologies and the subject matter, this then leads you into the next one where you'll talk about your aims and objectives. So if you've got some clarity of thought around your subject, your research project, and what you want to achieve, you can start to articulate it here and then move it forward into the next section. So hopefully that makes some sense. Is that clear, Joe? Have you lost it again? No, I've lost my little thing. Here we go. Okay, thanks, Joe. It's a little bit, I think I'm in the dungeons in the Babbage building, and it's a bit of a nightmare with the connection down here. But I think I'm coming towards the end of this. I think there's a lot of information there for you. I think there's a huge amount of information. I'm very happy to answer questions via email. I'm very happy to answer questions on Monday or whenever, because I'm on the module anyway. Getting this right is really important because it sets the whole of your research project, your proposal and your project up to be successful. If you have a weak literature review, you have a weak structure and don't have the right literature, then you're setting the entire project up to be less successful. Okay, so getting this bit right, it's worth having that extra hour or two, which I know is hard to find, believe me. Spending it on this now, and then hopefully the rest will then flow quite nicely. I'm hoping that makes sense. I am going to stop recording and then I'll open your mic, Joe. Okay.